I wanted to discuss this today with Indigenous advocate, Alice Springs Councillor and voice of reason, Jacinta Price. I caught up with her earlier.
It's an important part of our history in this nation, and tearing down statues and that sort of thing, I don't see how that lends itself to enabling Aboriginal people to face some of their really serious issues, really. It's about self-gratification and nothing more than that. And of course, sanitising our history doesn't allow us to learn from it either, and to make sure that, you know, we don't repeat some of the atrocities of our history.
Now, Jacinta, tell us about Black Lives Matter. Now, of course, Black Lives Matter. You know that more than anybody else. You've seen so many lives lost in your own communities over the years. But what is it about the public debate around Black Lives Matter in Australia today that worries you, that is paradoxical?
That there's a failure, an absolute failure, and a level of denial of the black-on-black violence that is far more prevalent than Indigenous, black deaths in custody, and that a lot of the left-wing media are largely ignoring these facts, and effectively they are part of silencing those victims that continue to this day. I mean, in the last week, there's been several Indigenous deaths, black deaths in our nation. There's the 4 young lives that were taken in Townsville, who had taken young teenagers who had stolen a car and crashed it, and 4 young people who had died as a result of that. Now, if that had been part of a police pursuit and that could be labelled as 4 deaths in custody, then I have no doubt the media, the left-wing media and these protesters would most definitely have something to say about that. Of course, there was a stabbing death of my nephew last weekend. So, there are a raft of lives lost, and yet the left-wing media certainly don't want to have a bar of it. They're continuing to push a particular narrative which is really destructive and it's not helpful whatsoever. It's more about virtue signalling than it is actually doing the right thing by reporting on these issues.
Jacinta, you've been campaigning on these issues for years. You've been talking to us on my television programs for 3 or 4 years at least, and you were doing a lot more before that about trying to draw attention to these issues, trying to get governments and other people focused on them. Yet it's the death of an African-American man in Minneapolis that gets people on the streets in Australia, despite the fact that so many lives are being lost through these processes across Australia every month of every year.
That's right. It's a tunnel vision. It's sort of keeping the blinkers on, making sure that all they want to do is point at white perpetrators or claim that there's systemic racism in our judicial system, in our police forces, which is completely untrue. And of course, as I've said over and over again, the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody has completely ruled out this claim, and yet they're still happy to run with it. Left-wing media is happy to run with this narrative, and again, it's furthering. It's ignoring the real issues, which is further entrenching them and going to create more problems for Aboriginal people.
I suppose on the bright side, Jacinta, given there's so much of a focus on these issues now, that you are getting calls from various ABC radio and television programs to share your perspective on them, that Fairfax newspapers and others are contacting you so you can actually talk to people about the real live issues in communities day in, day out?
No, there isn't anything like that coming from left-wing media. I did, astonishingly, have an invitation to speak on the project last week. It's the 4th invitation I've ever had from them, but I've always cancelled at the last minute and made some excuse for not having me appear on their program.
Hang on a second, Jacinta. The ABC, as we know, focuses a lot on Indigenous issues, and so they should. But surely with all these issues around, and you as a former LNP candidate, a current Alice Springs councillor, you write op-eds, you have a position with the Centre for Independent Studies, surely they come to you to get a perspective on these issues.
Look, the last time I've had an interview with the ABC was on Radio National, and it was in fact with talking about the other week celebrating Reconciliation Week, and it was in fact Tom Switzer's program. Of course, Tom Switzer heads up the Centre for Independent Studies. That's the last time I've spoken with any ABC journalists whatsoever, not even my local ABC, interested.
That's astonishing when we're talking about these issues. So if you want to talk about personal responsibility, if you want to talk about law and order issues inside Indigenous communities, the Australian media, by and large, doesn't want to know about it.
By and large, they don't want to know about it. No, there's a narrative that's being pushed, and people are quite happy to push that particular narrative. It's
extraordinary, Jacinta. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me again, Chris.
Jacinta Price there. Let's bring in the panel now. And I'm joined from Sydney by author and columnist for The Spectator Australia, Rebecca Weiser. From Adelaide, we're joined by academic and columnist with The Australian, Jennifer Oriel. And from the Central Coast, we're joined to columnist for The Daily Telegraph and blogger to The Nation, Tim Blair. Thanks all for joining us. Perhaps I'll go to you first, Rebecca. Can you understand, or I know it wouldn't surprise you, but can you understand how a voice like Jacinta Price's is not heard on the ABC? They don't want to hear from her on Indigenous issues. It's such a big issue. They spend so much time on it. Why don't they want to hear from her?
Well, Jacinta's got two big obstacles to getting onto the ABC. First is that actually they don't really cover Indigenous issues from the point of view of really getting out to Indigenous communities anywhere to the degree that, for example, a paper like the Australian newspaper, which really dedicated itself to covering this issue. So that's the first problem. They don't really want to get, and certainly don't want to get out to places like where Jacinta is living. And secondly, the problem is they don't want real diversity. Yes, if they get somebody on, they'll want somebody who is Indigenous but shares their point of view. And I'm sure the reason why the project at the last minute suddenly decides it can't have Jacinta Price on is because, oh, my goodness, she's not going to trot out the usual sort of left-wing narrative, you know. And Jacinta is just such a wonderful and inspiring speaker because she doesn't play the victimhood card. She talks about the progress that the country has made over hundreds of years and how the place is so much better and why we should celebrate those achievements instead of dwelling on the bad parts of our history. Yes, they're there, but haven't we come a long way since then? And that's what I love about her.